Welcome, everybody. This is the first edition of the Ask the Author 2021. I have with me my colleague Lucy Kirstein, who's a policy analyst at the International Transport Forum and who's been leading a project called Connecting Remote Communities. And we published the report last week. And as you may know, every time we publish a report, about a week later, we do one of these Ask the Author sessions to get in touch with people who've maybe already read it and have some questions, or just to give the opportunity to ask questions to those who maybe intend to read it. So the focus on what we do today is very much on you, on the readers or potential readers, to ask your questions, to dive a little deeper and also to engage with us. Before I hand over to Lucy, just a quick few housekeeping remarks. The first one is this is very short. It's 30 minutes to make it easier for you. We'll have a presentation by Lucy of about 10 minutes and then have 20 minutes of questions. The way to ask a question is please to type it into the Q&A function. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon with two bubbles and the letters Q and A. So type your question into that anytime. You don't have to wait until the end of the presentation. I will be going through them and passing them on to Lucy after her presentation. The topic today, remote communities, is really quite interesting, I find. There are a lot of signs that over the past 3 or 4 years, citizens living in rural areas have become more vocal about actually their discontent. We have had the Gilets jaunes here in France and other regions, similar movements. In Italy, the rural electors were the ones that decided the last election. Let's see what happens in the next one that may be coming up. And what's really happened is that perhaps there's been too much talk about cities as centers of creativity and economic growth and so on and so forth, driven a little bit by urban elites also, if I can use that word, who tend to sit in the policy think tanks and so on and so forth. And that's given people out there the feeling that they're a little bit forgotten, apparently. So one of the main issues that causes them to grumble is that transport connectivity often isn't very good. So moving to the city is actually then the dark side of not having opportunities where they would actually like to live. So fortunately, governments have begun to take up this question, and the roundtable that we held, which is the basis of what we're talking about today, is precisely a sign of that. So I'm very curious. I haven't had the opportunity to read the whole report. I've read a little bit, but very curious to hear some more about that from Lucy. I'll hand over to her straight away. But before I do that, I'll tell you that towards the end of the session, we'll be throwing a couple of polling questions at you, which you can answer just with one click. It's basically, did you like this? Did you find it useful or not? That gives us some data that we can use to make this format better and more suited to what you would like it to be. So without further ado, let me hand over to Lucy Kirstein to take us through some findings of the report on connecting remote communities. Lucy.
Yeah, hi everyone, welcome. I've seen a few familiar names in the registrants as well, so welcome everybody. Some who have themselves participated in the roundtable, so glad to have everyone there. So the report I'm presenting today is the result of an event that we organized in September 2019 together with Transport Canada. And the meeting was chaired by Gunnar Lindberg, who's the Director General of the Norwegian Institute of Transport Economics. The event was opened by Deputy Minister Michael Keenan of Transport Canada, and the event brought together more than 30 experts from academia, government, and industry. Of course, all the speeches and presentations are available on the ITF YouTube channel if you'd ever like to watch them again. Michael mentioned it already, the majority of currently ongoing projects in transport also at the ITF focus on accessibility in cities, and there is no surprise in that. More and more people live in urban areas, and there are enormous issues with air pollution, congestion, and other things. At the same time, you can see on the slide that the share of people living outside of cities and far from any city can in some cases make up an important part of the overall population. And by the way, this data comes from our OECD colleagues working on rural development, can be found on the website of the OECD regional statistics. More, of course, also on other demographic or social and economic indicators can be found there. From 4 of the countries where many people still do live in remote areas, we've commissioned case studies that are published as discussion papers, also last and this week. And in each case, we consciously coupled an expert with a government official to maximize the value of the discussions and have a proper review of the case. They each have a specific focus. So the Canadian paper looks mainly at northern and Arctic air connectivity. The one from Greece focuses on island transport and ways to measure remoteness across different criteria, different indicators. And the ones from Chile and Scotland look at public transport and infrastructure across different modes. Here are the references. And of course, you can simply Google connecting remote communities, ITF, and you'll find all the papers associated to this project. The case studies, of course, as well as the experience from the around 20 countries at the roundtable showed that there are areas that are geographically, socially, and economically quite diverse. So yeah, I mean, what's a remote community? It really differs from country to country, but they have a number of challenges in common. First of all, they often face high cost of transport per passenger due to difficult geography, low density of demand. Communities also struggle with disruptions due to climate change, as well as lack of transport and infrastructure network resilience. For example, shutdown of lines or delay of road maintenance because of budget austerity, or as we've seen last year, because of COVID-19. These transportation issues are, of course, interlinked with other economic and social issues, but I don't have the time to discuss in detail. But what it shows is that without state support for transport and infrastructure, many communities would simply not be able to survive. And many of these communities already struggle a lot with depopulation. As I said, these communities are quite dependent on state support. And we've created a taxonomy to look at what kind of support states provide across all different transport modes. And these range from direct subsidies to indirect subsidies like tax breaks, transfers of risk from the private sector to government, shadow subsidies, for example, that include ring fencing of slots at airports, or restricted competition or exemption from licensing rules, for example, to provide a maritime freight service to an island. And you can find an overview of that on page 19 of the report, and a number of examples from different countries in the annex as well. One of the questions that we discussed is also, how do countries determine the level of support that communities receive in the first place? And there are 2 predominant approaches that we looked at. The first one on the left side strongly relies on cost-benefit analysis. The problem with this is, of course, that in remote areas, due to the lack of density of demand, it's quite difficult to make the economic case for a transport link and account for all the relevant social and economic impacts that this intervention will have. The second approach on the right determines the level of support based on eligibility determined by a remoteness index, including the geographic distance, of course, but also other indicators of isolation. And it relies on specific equity goals or minimum access thresholds and doesn't require cost-benefit analysis. So this approach is used in Chile. And we think it could indeed be useful to base the decision-making on what could be called explicit accessibility objectives. In other words, established desirable levels of accessibility that must be guaranteed to citizens. So in that case, we think that tools such as weighted multi-criteria analysis could be well suited to appraise interventions with such objectives. And this is not something completely unthinkable, as, for example, governments like Flanders and Belgium are already implementing an accessibility-based system. Of course, the CBA approach may remain the norm and the legal requirement in many countries. So to help people deal with the methodological challenges of considering all impacts of transport schemes in remote areas, you'd need harmonized guidelines, including, for example, calculation handbooks, ready-made survey templates, to actually help people locally carry out CBA that better reflects realities in these areas, while also saving resources spent on these assessments. While looking at the different schemes, we've also identified common design and implementation challenges. For example, it's not unusual that tenders for services to islands and remote areas attract only one bidder. This lack of competition in the bidding and actually the high transaction costs related to tendering means that tendering might not be the adequate way of providing access to remote places in the long term. In fact, we think that communities may obtain better outcomes through negotiated performance-based contracts that are based on achieving defined objectives, reflected, for example, in KPIs or other incentive regimes. They're used, for example, in Victoria in Australia to award public service contracts. Second, a few countries have observed unintended incentives generated by subsidies. So when local authorities didn't bear any responsibility for funding of support, they tended to overbid for support and might be best to make them responsible for at least half of the funding or devolve responsibility to the regions. Third, there were issues with monitoring and revision of support measures. So currently information on the effectiveness of schemes is quite sparse, and impact reports and findings are rarely made public. At the same time, there's a lack of reliable, up-to-date information on contracts, revenue, subsidies, fares, frequencies, locations of stops, etc. Also on the performance or the number of passengers. For example, there are some authorities who do not collect performance indicators from operators, and sometimes the operators don't even have this information in a machine-readable format. And data is, of course, also key to establish the need of residents. Often you don't necessarily have data on demographic and socioeconomic profiles in these areas, their mobility behavior, modal splits, and the dependence on public or special transport, and travel times to services, frequencies of trips by purpose, etc., etc. Even access to internet and mobile phone is not always available. And that's where we actually recommended that local residents should be involved in data collection, as it's the case, for example, in hard to reach remote Aboriginal communities in Australia, where they've trained Aboriginal researchers to better assess needs locally. The fourth point is we think that the way transport is organized in these areas could be a little bit more flexible and innovative. And we should, of course, avoid implementing city solutions on a smaller scale. Instead, we think that innovations could be developed from the rural areas in question or from the remote areas. And lastly, the fifth point, there could be much more coordination between regional policy actors across transport, but also basic services and internet connectivity. And I can give you a few examples later in the Q&A. And just the last point I wanted to make is the lack of general accessibility plans or strategies across transport and basic services. Only very few countries have target-based rural transport plans. And a notable exception is maybe Canada, who have developed the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework that addresses broadband, energy, transport, social challenges in a more holistic way. This just gives you an overview of the recommendations that you find in the executive summary of that report. And due to the lack of time, I'm not going into them, but please have a look. And this last slide is just to say that we're, of course, continuing the work on rural mobility. So last spring, we launched a working group on mobility innovations for the periphery. So we're looking at peri-urban, rural, and remote areas and the mobility innovations that are shaping there. So if you're interested to get involved in any of these activities, please just email me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That was hugely interesting, and I appreciate that the time is very short. Maybe you could get back to the first slide to make us don't give the impression that we're over, because now is where we really start with the discussion. I have 3 questions in the chat already. If you have questions, put them in now. I get to answer the first one, which was whether the recording of the session is going to be shared. And indeed, it's going to be available on the ITF website. In normal circumstances, should be there tomorrow afternoon, barring any tech hitches. So if you go to itf-oecd.org and put in connecting remote communities, you'll find that very quickly, or go to the ITF YouTube channel. So let me quickly get to the questions. The first one comes from Airports Council International, from Philippe Villard. And he's asking about cross-subsidies, which for airports is kind of an established practice, that the less used and probably more remote airports are cross-subsidized by the hubs, as it were. Is there something that the report or the experts say about this approach of the airport network approach, and to maybe identify essential airports that should be maintained with subsidies, cross-subsidies?
The report doesn't go as far as going into these issues, but I think it's a very relevant point you make, and I really appreciate your comment, and I will take it for any potential future projects in this area. I think it's something that we didn't get the time to discuss in the roundtable, but it's something we definitely consider in future projects.
So that's maybe something to take up in the working group then. Second question comes from Werner Hammerken from Royal Arctic Line in Greenland. And Werner says that they find that a remoteness index that combines time, distance, and connectivity and health education, other aspects, could be something really interesting to help strategic planning for remote areas. Do you have any views on what could be the best sources for a formally evaluated and referenceable index methodology? This sort of question of indexing, is that something you've discussed and thought about?
Yes, I'm very glad about that question, because it's something that we discussed a lot at the roundtable, and indeed there is one case study that deals extensively with coming up with a new remoteness index and defining, in that case, it's islands. So it's the case study on Greek islands that you can find on the event website. It's in that case, it's for maritime transport to islands, freight and passenger. But I think the discussions that are in that could also help you, with what you are planning to come up. Then also, I'd recommend you to look into the Chilean case study or get in touch with statistics in Chile, because they're also actually developing a new remoteness index that combines different criteria, different indicators, as you say. And of course, you can simply get in touch with me. I can also put you in touch with the relevant people who are developing these indices in their countries.
One of the things that you mentioned on your slide with the challenges was the unintended incentives that some subsidies create. And there's a question from Ana Moreno Monroy here, asking whether the report considers the case of subsidies for service users such as students that have to travel long distances, and how is the incentive structure impacted by subsidies there?
We don't go that specifically into details for specific users or for essential transport services, but there are a few examples in Australia where education has been organized in a more innovative way. For example, the School of the Air, and that also goes for the flying doctor services. And then in Finland, they have made very positive experiences with combining different statutory transport services. So those services that are already publicly subsidized, but by different government entities. And so they combine trips using an app and allow broader public passengers to use school transport and other means of transport to reduce costs.
I have a couple of questions on the next steps in the work of ITF, which I maybe try to combine sort of in terms of the issue of cost-benefit analysis and sort of refining that and making that more suitable. What are things that the upcoming working group could think about? And secondly, in terms of the technologies and the innovations that's in the title of that working group, is there anything that you're looking at specifically that could be of value for connectivity in remote areas?
So in that case, we're specifically looking at surface transports. Unfortunately, we couldn't broaden our scope to look at all transport modes this time. But we're mainly looking at ways to provide more flexible transportation. So demand responsive transports mainly, and integrating services like demand responsive transport or car sharing or peer-to-peer car renting into a broader transport network, and to feed main transport lines to make people actually less car dependent in rural areas. But of course, we're looking at a lot of innovations that might not necessarily be suitable in very remote areas. And in very remote areas where population is as sparse that really the transport services are not viable, we're more looking at community transport organized together with volunteers, because the driver costs can make up often up to 60% of the operating costs. And so communities can save a lot of money by integrating volunteers into their services.
The next question is from Alex Blackburn and at UNEC, who asks about the Sustainable Development Goals, where the only rural connectivity indicator is an SDG 911, distance to an all-season road. And he wonders, or he thinks that this is not hugely relevant for developed countries, and asks whether from our research, are there any indicators you would recommend or encourage countries to publish to track rural connectivity for monitoring SDGs?
So the usual problem that we see is that often the remoteness is defined on driving time to a certain service center or population center. And of course, this doesn't really include populations who do not have access to a car. So ideally, the indicators that track accessibility, they should definitely include public transport, access to public transport, and affordability of transport as well.
This is a quick, short way. It's not remote from each other. The report highlights climate change as a challenge. Decarbonization in remote communities was considered as a factor and could be incorporated as a part of the issue.
Sorry, Michael, I've had difficulty understanding you. There were some...
The report highlights climate change as a challenge, and Karen Barras asks whether delivering transport decarbonization in remote communities was considered as a factor.
Yeah, I think for the governments who were present, this wasn't the top one priority, but I have to say for countries like Canada, this was a very important factor, mainly the resilience of the infrastructure that is affected by climate change. You have a lot of ice roads, and with permafrost thaw, these ice roads are simply endangered and can sometimes not longer be used. And on the other side, sea transport can be used for a longer season than before. So there are a few changes that they're looking at, but it's also a problem for the infrastructure, for example, for airports in these areas. Simply given the fact that the soil erodes due to lacking permafrost, it just makes the infrastructure very vulnerable. But then on decarbonizing transport, of course, the CO2 emissions per passenger or per freight unit are quite high because of the long distances and the low occupancy rates. But it's not something that we've been able to consider in that work, but we're considering it in the work of the working group on innovative mobility for the periphery. And we're trying to see what alternatives are there to replace car use, or at least second car use in rural areas.
We'll have to come to an end soon. I have tried to get a couple more questions because they're really interesting. Just giving our audience the warning that towards the end, in a minute or two, a kind of poll will pop up to give you the opportunity to evaluate what you've been participating in. So don't be surprised, just have a quick look. There are 2 buttons to click and that's it. It'll help us to get better. I have a very interesting question from Ruth Lopian of the European Commission, who asks whether we've taken a more granular look at the dwellers in remote regions, because being remote is not the only factor that drives their connectivity needs. Have we looked at women as people with disability, poor people, different categories that live in those remote regions?
We've only basically included this in a recommendation that you actually need data on the socio-demographic profiles of people that live in these areas, and that you basically need to consider that needs might be quite different, and that just simply putting in place a transport service, a general transport service running twice per day is not really the solution, but to have a flexible solution in place that can actually cater for the needs of people who don't necessarily have access to that. But it's a question that we have taken on in more detail in the working group as well. So that's in the subgroup 5 for this working group, in case you want to get involved, and if you're working on the topic, and we're looking at user needs and behavioral aspects in rural transport.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lucy. So our time is up. Unfortunately, there's still a number of questions unanswered, and also some interesting hints on case studies in Scotland and Belgium and other regions that are a little bit detailed and too long to reference them here, but they'll certainly help us to look at those and maybe feed them into sort of the next cycle of this work. Quite generally, what we're doing this because we don't want to kind of unilaterally throw information at people, but we want to engage in a serious dialogue with people who are also working on these issues and trying to find better solutions. So by all means, do get in touch with us, with Lucy. You know, if you have further questions or yours haven't been answered here, this is work in progress, and we're all in it together. So we'd love to hear from you and engage with you. I would just like to thank everyone for joining us, for having been here. For some, it's early in the morning. For some, it's late at night. I really appreciate that, your interest. I would like to thank Lucy for steering this report through the gestation and presenting the results to us today. You'll be able to review this 30 minutes on our website, as I said, probably as of tomorrow. I hope it works technically. 2 times it took a day longer, but it'll be there. Also, there's the video recording of the chair's summary of the roundtable and of the roundtable presentations. So if you're interested in specific aspects, check out the project page of the roundtable. You might find some information that digs a little deeper than the report. Thank you all very much. I wish you a very good day, a very good night, depending on where you are. Hope you enjoyed this, took something from it, and to see you again the next time when we have another Ask the Author very soon. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.